Hi, everybody. There's a recording in progress. Happy Victoria Day. And what's a better way to celebrate that queen, Victoria, than looking at the true queen of the Torah? Of course. So we're going to look at, I think, a number of texts that I think are especially important to look at in the wake of Shavuos. Um, Shavuos is the end of a lot of things. It is the end of the three holiday cycle that starts, at least with the calendar that we have it nowadays, it starts with Sukkot. It's the first major of the three pilgrimage holidays, then continues into Pesach, and then Pesach initiates its own mini cycle of 50 days that culminates with Shavuos, right? It's the end of the Omer, like we're counting up to Shavuos, and then it's over. You don't have to count the Omer anymore. You don't have any more holidays until the fall, you know. So Shavuos really feels like the end. But there's a risk with that because Shavuos is the holiday of revelation. And if we think of Shavuos as being the end, then we think of receiving the Torah as just a thing that happened, rather than it being the initiating event of a relationship with God. I think that's what Simchas Torah feels like, a celebration of something. It's framed as a wedding. We're dancing with the Torah. We're excited. And it feels like something is starting again because we're starting the Torah again. But with Shavuos, it's not tied to the lectionary cycle, right? It's just kind of crammed in there. It's not tied to starting the Torah again. It feels like less connected to the event of revelation. So I want to intervene a little bit and actually try to reconnect the holiday of Shavuot to the event of Matan Torah, to the event of the giving of the Torah. How so? Well, I want us to look at the moment of the reception of the Torah, not just as the climax of this story, right? Leaving Egypt, and then it culminates in the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. But it's really, I want to say, it's both that climax, it's that culmination, it's that fulfillment of the liberation we experienced out of Egypt. But on the other hand, it's also not just the ending of something, it's also the initiation of something new. It's the initiation of a new kind of relationship with God, a new kind of way of functioning in the world, preparing us to enter the land of Canaan, to have our own autonomous society, one that is guided by God's principles. So how is the receiving of the Torah both an end and a beginning? Well, luckily, we're going to look at a pasuk that has a very famous, troubling Janus word. A Janus word is like the word January, referring to the Roman fake god, who a figure of which was buried underneath the doorposts of Roman homes. It was like their anti-mezuzah. And it was a face that looked both forward and backwards, because every beginning is a new beginning's end, or whatever that song is, right? Every ending is a new beginning, and every beginning is a new end. So the face looks back, the face looks forward, because the new year is the end of the old year, but the beginning of a new one. So we're going to look at this pasuk, which has a word that functions in the exact same way. A Janus word is both one thing and its opposite. It's a kol gadol velo yasaf. There was a great voice that did not continue, or it did continue. We're going to see. That's what we're going to explore. So let's look at the source. Great. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay. Great. Okay. So here's the pasuk. We're looking at it. It's from the parsha of Eschanan, and which is, the whole book of Deuteronomy, right? It's called by the rabbis Mishneh Torah. It's called, well, the word Deuteronomy is the same thing. It means the Torah another time, like another run through of the Torah. It's like the review of the Torah. It's the spark notes of the Torah. But there's little tweaks that are a little bit different, right? One of the famous examples is that when in Va'eschanan it gives us the Ten Commandments again. Instead of saying Zachor Yom HaShabbos HaKodshay, it says Shamor Yom HaShabbos HaKodshay. Instead of saying remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, it says keep the Sabbath and make it holy. So it's like little differences, and that's what the rabbis say. God says one thing, but we hear two. That God's language contains more than just simple human meaning. God's language contains multiple meanings inside of them. God's meaning is explosive, not contained. So here we have this kind of irrepressible or perhaps overwhelming model of revelation. So it says, Esa devarim ha'eleh, Diber Hashem al kol kalchem bahar mitoch ha'esh ha'anan v'arafel kol gadol v'lo yasaf vayichtevem al shnei luchos avanim vayitneim elai. So these words God spoke to the whole community at the mountain from amidst the fire and the cloud and the darkness. There was a great voice that v'lo yasaf, and we'll look at that word in a second. And Moses inscribed these words on 2 tablets of stone, famously, and God inscribed on the 2 tablets of stone with God's finger. This is kind of God's finger. That revelation happened directly. It was written in heavenly script on the tablets. And it says famously in the Gemara, I think in Menachos, that the letters look the same frontwards and backwards. Like if you turned the tablet the other way around, it would look the same, which is impossible. So it's God. So yeah, God does cool things. And then God gave the tablets to Moshe Rabbeinu. So here's this phrase: on the mountain, from the fire, the cloud, and the darkness, there was a great voice that did that, v'lo yasaf. So with the word yasaf can either mean to continue, like the word to gather, like Chag Asif, right? The holiday of ingathering. That's what Sukkot is called, because it's a harvest, right? And it's accreting, it's growing. Or it's like the word sof, like ending. Right, so we see the root here, samech pei. It's either like the word to accrete, to continue, or it means to end. So it's either that it did not continue, or it did not end. It's not clear what it's trying to say in the pshat. What do you think? Before we get into all the meforshim, all the commentaries, blah 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 blah. What do you think? Option A or option B? It didn't continue? Like this, like revelation was something that is discrete, or it did not end. Revelation is something that resonates further. And why? What would motivate each of those reasons? No wrong answers. I need something. Yeah.
I think it means a voice that did not end, as in because God is in, it was like a sound that was also like infinite in a way, that was sort of continued on and on and on. Maybe like the words came.
Okay, so you're saying that God being infinite, God's self, anything that's coming out of God can't be strictly contained.
If that makes Yes.
Okay, yeah, great, that makes sense. Okay, anyone have any, want to take the other side? No wrong answers.
Wait, isn't there a right or a wrong answer though?
No. The only wrong answer is that there is a right or a wrong answer.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Someone just for the sake of argument take the other side. Come on, pretend you're in like moot court. Someone's arguing for, the other person's arguing against.
Okay. Reason for did not continue.
Yeah.
But I can't think of one.
Okay.
Because
that seems like it's like parsimonious, like God's being like greedy. Like I don't want to say too much.
What about just playing devil's advocate would be God spoke and that's and what he said and what was put down and that's it. And that's the final word.
Okay, so there's a sense of finality to it. Right. I mean, imagine, right, this so like Renee's answer, let's say, is like on the more like woo-woo side in the sense like, listen, God's infinite, like everything God says, it's so much, right? But then, like, on the other hand, is like saying, like, listen, this is a revelation to people who need to use it. So if it's an unstable object, right, you can't define it. How can you use it as a law code? What kind of, how could you use it to make your society, right? If it's like still going on, right? There's this argument nowadays in American constitutional law between people who argue that the Constitution is a living document that does not end, right? In some ways, it's still growing, still defining itself. And then there's textualists and or originalists like Antonin Scalia and others, more conservative approach, which say that, listen, the Constitution is what the words on the page say, and the only way we can really understand it is by going to like 18th century dictionaries to figure out when people said, these words, when people wrote these words down, what they meant, right? It has a discrete, finite meaning, and if the only way for us to know what it means is to know what it means. So this is, famous, like, this really, I think, gets at the heart of what it means to have, I think, a religious legal tradition. A tradition of law that's not just about the words on the page, as it were, but it's also something that has still a maintained connection to its source, right? That God's presence in the law is not just something that is it's not just, the question is like, is God's connection as the origin of the law something that is still persistent, right? I.e., is actually God still giving the law in some way, and that would mean it did not end? Or is it the case, in a sense, that God's connection to the law is a historical event, it's a point in time, and God gave us something, and then that thing needs to be defined and understood in itself. Another way also thinking about why it might mean that did not continue is that there's also a tradition, especially in Deuteronomy, that also in Exodus too, that God's revelation is so overwhelming, such an overwhelming experience, that human beings couldn't even contain it, couldn't handle it, and that the Israelites had to nominate Moses as an intermediary between them. So perhaps actually, like, that it's a great voice that did not continue, in the sense that it was something actually that human beings had only a certain amount of tolerance for. Okay, so now we have the two options, and again, there's no right, there's no wrong. They both are defensible readings of the text, and we're going to look at the different Meforshim, the different commentaries that have a take in this. So this is the Rashbam. Rashbam was Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, was one of the grandsons of Rashi, and is especially renowned for being a very pshat-oriented Meforish. Not only that, he actually is the first, as far as I know, the first rabbi to actually use the term pshat in referring to the nature of his commentary. Rashi, his grandfather, is seen as a pashtan, is seen as a pshat commentary, but interestingly, he actually never uses the phrase pshat. The phrase he uses is pshuto shel mikra, the literal, simple sense of the scripture. But his grandson, Rashbam, actually uses the term pshat to refer to what it is that he is doing. So Rashbam is seen for people, exact people, pshat people. He's seen as like the father of pshat. So, and unlike Rashi, while being a Pashtan, it's true, but he is, in a sense, selecting the midrashim that Rashi thinks lend the best tools we have to understand the contextual meaning of the text. Whereas Rashbam is not a midrashic commentary. He's just going based on grammar and going on his own literary readings. So Rashbam is, there's a whole cult around Rashbam. People love Rashbam, actually, especially in Toronto. Marty Lukshin published the authoritative editions of Rashbam's commentary, some of which are fragmentary. So, good Toronto Meforish. So he says velo yasaf, and it does not end or continue. What is it? He says shuv lo nosaf kol gadol kazeh ba'olam lefi pshuto. Aha, pshuto. Ki kol yasaf lashon tosefes. He says velo yasaf. What does this mean? I don't know. Okay. He says shuv lo nosaf. It does not continue. Kol gadol kazeh, like this great, magnificent, powerful voice in this world, lefi pshuto. Never again could there ever be an event as powerful as this. So this is actually what I was saying before, just now, is that on one hand, we've looked at mostly the Hefza, right? We looked at the Torah. But if we actually look at not Gavra, but if we look at the source of Torah, of God, and God's dialogue partner, human beings, right? For a voice this powerful to exist in the world, it's too much. So he doesn't take it as that it stopped, but rather he says this is a singular event. So he takes the word lo yasaf as it was never repeated. So we saw yasaf as like to extend its substance, right? To make it longer, to make it more. But this is actually saying it was never reiterated. Nothing like this could ever happen again. So he takes lo yasaf to lock down this event as being so transcendently amazing that nothing like it has ever and will ever happen again. And I think that's really in an around the corner kind of way, it's saying something about the nature of revelation. That Rashbam is really singling out Matan Torah at Sinai as being something unlike anything that has ever been before, and unlike anything that ever could be. That there's something special about that contact point with God that's more than just like a chiddush you have or something like that, more than just like sensing God's presence. This was God's full force revelation, right, which really singled it out as being something radically unique. So shuv lo nosaf kol gadol kazeh ba'olam lefi pshuto. That's very interesting to use that phrase, lefi pshuto. Well, he's in lefi pshuto, saying like, I think it's referring to lo yasaf. He's saying, listen, according to a pshat, according to like the dictionary definition of the word lo yasaf, it means it did not repeat. But I wonder if actually this is even a little ambiguous, but to say lo kefi pshuto, like according to God's radical nature, right? God's purity, God's simplicity, not in the sense of like it's easy, but in the sense of like it's something that's so particularly itself. That God is so God that it could never, like something like that. It's radically unlike anything that's ever happened, can ever happen. So like really singling out the moment of revelation, the event of revelation as something special. And I think that's a really important point, right? Is that he's focusing our attention on how powerful of a moment this is. Well, let's bring this back to Shavuos, right? Because I know this year's Shavuos, like last year's Shavuos, was a different kind of Shavuos. But if we remember what it's like to be kind of like bleary-eyed in the morning, right? To be hearing the giving of the Ten Commandments at Har Sinai. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's two sets of ta'amim, two sets of trope for the Ten Commandments in Yisro. There's the upper, ta'amei elyon, and there's the lower, ta'amei tachton. The ta'amei elyon are probably the ones you're most familiar with, even though they're the ones that are kind of weird because they don't follow the verse pattern. They actually follow the commandment pattern. It makes the whole commandment like one big verse. The ta'amei tachton are the normal trope, and it goes according to the verses. You know the upper one because the upper one is the one that's used in shul. So there's this whole like sacred choreography, sacred theater around making the restaging of revelation on Shavuos something that is unique, something that is special, something that's impactful. The Haftorah we read is also a moment, is a Haftorah of revelation, one that actually the rabbis say we're not supposed to read as a Haftorah, but we do it. it's Ezekiel's prophetic moment of contact with God, another overwhelming, synesthetic, prophetic experience, right? Of seeing the chariot and its overwhelming sensory nature. So on Shavuos, it's not, we stay up all night. It's a common tradition. And we learn Torah all night. And there's one of the ways we understand what the Tikkun Leil Shavuos is you actually kind of do a speed run of all of Torah. You like look at the first verse and the last verse of every book of the Torah, every book of the Tanakh, and then you look at the first Mishnah and last Mishnah of every book of the Mishnah, of every Masechta of the Mishnah. So you kind of like just like have a sense of like having done all of Torah, right? We've done it all. We've received it. We've tasted a little bit of each part of it. And then you're like kind of like a little tripped out. You're pretty tired. You're like a little woozy. And I think part of the point is to try to touch, like to get back in touch with what that experience was like, to restage the moment of revelation. So it's not just about like the process of revelation, but to actually get in touch with this moment. And Shavuos, in this way, is about touching that moment. More, Simchas Torah is about Torah, but Shavuos is about Sinai, right? It's about the moment of being given the Torah. It's the gift of the Torah. Simchas Torah is about Torah itself, but Shavuos is about the moment of receiving the gift. That's just, they're related, but they're distinct phenomena, and they have different sensibilities to them. Yeah, Renee? Oh, okay, so you unmuted yourself. All right, but when you have a chiddush, please. So I think Rashbam is, maybe we kind of first resisted this idea that Velo Yasaf, it did not continue, to be kind of like, oh, that makes me feel a little bit bummed out. But he actually says, no, it was never repeated because this was such a special thing that happened. Such a special thing, such a powerful thing, that it was so radically unique, and it should be recognized and treasured for its special qualities. A lovely point. Okay, so here we get to an older point of view from Shmos Rabbah. Although, interestingly, a lot of Shmos Rabbah, the first part of it is from the Amoraic period, but actually a lot of the back half of Shmos Rabbah was redacted, was edited in the Rashi's time. So yeah, maybe it's not as old. Midrash does not end. Velo Yasaf Midrash, for sure. It never continues. It never ends. So, Davar Acher, another idea. So they always have different readings of things. Like, no right or wrong answer. The rabbis agree. So it says, Vayidaber Elokim es kol advarim ha'ela lemor. God spoke all of these matters, saying, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, what does Rabbi Yitzchak think about this? He says, Masha Navim asidim lisnabos b'chol dor avador kiblu mehar Sinai. Oh, he says, every single thing that the prophets prophesied was originally received at Har Sinai. What do we take that to be in terms of like a model of revelation? And how does Rabbi Yitzchak justify that reading? Remember, the rabbis are readers. Everything they say, they are justifying by hermeneutics, right? The way that they read Torah. So how does Rabbi Yitzchak prove himself? What word in this original verse do you think he's lasering in on? Vayidaber Elokim es kol hadivarim ha'ela lemor. God spoke all of these things, saying.
I think it means that he spoke everything that was to come, and maybe even everything that had happened.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Rabbi Yitzchak is lasering on the word kol. Right? God spoke all of these words. Kol hadvarim, ha'ele. Right? Maybe these too. Right? All of these words. So it's not just this one specific verse or this one specific moment. He's saying no, revelation is actually something that's not just what we see in between Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vayakel, but revelation is actually something that we see continuing. It's holistic. It's, on one hand, it's actually a very conservative model in the sense of like everything was already given at Sinai, right? There's nothing new. Everything was given at Sinai, and anything the prophet says was already revealed. But on the other hand, it's actually quite a radical point of view in the sense of you only know that after someone prophesizes, right? So there's no, since it's saying it's everything, you can't know everything until you hear everything. So it keeps on representing itself with new things that that maybe were given on Har Sinai, but you don't know that yet. So for you, or from a person's eye, from a God's eye view, it's all been given. But from a person's eye view, Torah is never ending. Right? Because once a prophet arises in the ranks, and prophet has to be verified, as we see in Devarim 16, if I remember correctly, and in the Halachos and the Rambam, right? If a prophet arises in the ranks, you have to test them. You can't just let a false prophet go around. But once you verify the prophet, then prophecy is prophecy. So it has the same authoritative nature as Torah, because it was all given in the same bivat echat. It was all given in the same it's a whole set. It's a full set, right? Like a mathematical terms, right? A full set. It's every single number, every single revelation datum is in that set of Matan Torah at Sinai, and we only have exposure to it as it's revealed to us. So on one hand, again, revelation's over. Fine, revelation happened in that one moment. On the other hand, revelation is never ending, because we have yet to be presented with the full body of the full set of revelatums. So right? So it's that I think actually does touch on what Renee was saying in her explanation in the beginning, right? That actually the Torah is so large, right? So broad, so sizable, that while God reveals it all to someone like Moses, fine, but for us to be able to receive it all, it's going to have to be parceled out, and it's going to keep on reverberating outwards. Okay, so let's keep on going in the Midrash because it's not over yet. It says, "V'chein hu Omer." Similarly, the Torah says, "Esa dvarim ha'ela diber Hashem es kol kalchem." Now that's interesting because that is a very similar verse to what we just saw. It's a different verse. It says, all of these words, these words, God spoke to the whole community. So now kol is not actually attached to words anymore. Now kol, all, is connected. It modifies your community, your kihila, right? Your congregation. So now let's go back to this. Kol gadol v'lo yasaf, a great voice that did not yasaf. We'll leave that ambiguous. Rabbi Yochanan says, Kol echad nechlak l'shiva kolos. One voice. Now God spoke with one voice, but it's split into 7 voices. Vehem nechlakim l'shivim lashon. And those 7 voices split into 70 voices. So one splits into 7, and each of the 7 splits into 10. We always have to have our special numbers. But we end up having 70 voices. And one thing we know about, what else is 70 in Torah? 70 nations. 70 angels, one each appointed to each nation. 70 languages, one for each nation. Nation's a bad term for it, but one for each people. Cultures. Right, 70 is the number that is used by the Torah to refer to the multitude of peoples. So 70 languages, 70 voices of Torah seems to maybe imply that revelation is something that reaches universally. It's not saying there are 70 Torahs. There's one Torah. God spoke with one voice. But it is being broadcast in 70 different ways. So Reish Lakish says, Shemimenu nisnabu kol neviim sha'amdu. And from these 70 voices, he's trying to justify what Rabbi Yitzchak just said above. He's saying, and from these 70 voices, that's the grounding of each of the prophecies that the prophets prophesied. So he's saying these 70 voices, it's not just stretching out, let's say, in the world, spatially. It's actually reaching out, even beaming into the future. It's beaming through time, right? So that when the prophets prophesize, they're like transmitters, radio transmitters, receiving the beam of Torah, of revelation to their brains. So the moment of, so this subtly, in a way, is opposed to this. Rashbam says it was never repeated because it was such an amazing singular moment. I'm not saying it's an exact contradiction, but it's interesting that for Reish Lakish, it is an originating event. It's an origin story. It's an explosion of Torah that scatters outward like Lahavdil Elef Havdalas, like a cluster bomb, right? Like poof, out. Torah is spreading outwards like the opposite of shrapnel, but like spreading in that kind of way, right? And reaching throughout time and space, such that it is so revelation happens again and again and again and again and again.
But Josh, can I clarify something?
Sure.
Is it that we're not in the time of prophecy anymore, though? I had heard that said before.
Yeah, so the gates of prophecy have closed.
When did that happen?
Kind of. Sorry.
What does it kind of, like, that's confusing in that way. Like, is it or isn't it?
I'll say shortly, yes. So the classical understanding is that classical prophecy has closed. The closing of the gates of prophecy, as the rabbis call it, happened at the time of Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. Those are the last three prophets. And they're the last three prophets we see in the Tanakh. So that happens in the Persian period, if I remember correctly. 5th century, 6th century maybe. But that's true. So classical prophecy has ceased, except as I think I've gestured to, but haven't actually gone into too deeply in our classes on Kabbalah. A lot of medieval philosophy and mysticism uses the term prophet to refer to the state that they're trying to reach. So they do think that prophecy, and we see this even as late as the Mesilas Yesharim of the Ramchal, that they think that the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, is still accessible to people. The difference is, I think they would say, listen, we're not prophets like they were prophets. Classical prophets, God initiates that relationship, right? Like God bestows prophecy on the prophet. Although even in the Tanakh, we see actually in Malachim, we see a prophet like induce a state of prophecy through playing music. So it seems like, but like the big prophets, the literary prophets, right? God spoke through them, kind of like how God reveals the Torah to Moses. It's, from above down below. But for the medieval, mystical, philosophical model, prophecy is attained through human achievement, right? By like us, so it's from down up above. You ascend to a state of conjunction with God, right? Attaching yourself to God in dveikut, or as Rambam would say, to attach yourself to the active intellect, to God's mind. So yes, the gates of prophecy are closed technically, but also we have models for how Torah continues even today. There's a text I will conclude with at the end of the shir that I forgot to put in, and maybe I'll do a little bit of source sheet editing live. Watch what happens live. So maybe we'll find it. So I'll leave that there. But I want to leave that like a productively ambiguous sentiment. So I'll be very clear though. We don't have a new Torah, right? That's the main distinction with Christianity. Rabbis have a model of a revelation of two Torahs. But for us, it's the written Torah and the oral Torah. Not, right? And they were both given at Sinai, right? That's very clear in Pirkei Avos. The Christian model is that there was Torah, right? There was the Bible. And then there's like Bible 2 Electric Boogaloo, right? There's a second Bible. And it like retcons the rest of the Bible. For us, it is more complementary than it is supersessionist, in the sense that there's the written Torah and it is the foundation of everything. Oral Torah helps us it gives us a way to understand it. It gives us the lenses that we need to unpack its meaning. And in that way, oral Torah is generative because it produces meaning. It doesn't just fix itself like a new written text. Okay, so that's Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says that these 7 voices that split into 70 voices end up beaming all across space-time and end up triggering revelation throughout history until the gates of prophecy close, maybe. But then Rabbanan come around and say, and here's the maybe, Rabbanan being just like the anonymous, consensual voice of just like the rest of the rabbis who were around, said, Rabbanan Amre, Sheloi Haya Lo Baskol. So here we have a repetition of this tension. Rabbi Shimon says revelation resonates. He says revelation happens, right? It explodes, and shock waves are felt throughout throughout space-time. It reverberates. It's like imagine two planets getting close to each other, and their gravitational forces warp space-time. Right? That's what revelation is like. He agrees revelation's an incredible event. He agrees with Rashbam. Rashbam's later, but whatever. He agrees with Rashbam. Revelation was amazing. So amazing, it changed the universe, right? By like beaming Torah throughout space and time into the future. Whereas the rabbis say, what's special here is that God's voice did not echo. Baskol means literally daughter of a voice, but idiomatically means an echo. Further idiomatically, it comes to mean in rabbinic literature a kind of revelation, an echo of revelation. So back to Shosh's question. Yes, the gates of prophecy closed. The rabbis are very clear about that. Except that they do see themselves as still being able to hear a baskol. Now, a baskol is not just the literal echo of what was said at Sinai. Baskol is the term that the rabbis use for God's further communication with humankind. But it seems like the rabbis see themselves as kind of being like after the golden age, right? They don't see themselves as being prophets. The rabbis are not they do not see themselves as prophets. Unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the Qumran communities, who wrote what was called psharim, kind of like apocalyptic commentaries on prophetic texts, like writing commentaries on prophecies like Ezekiel, Isaiah, etc., saying like, oh, it's about now. I'm writing a commentary that's saying it's about right now. This prophecy is happening now. The rabbis didn't do that. They weren't apocalyptic in that kind of way. They related to all of Torah as always being true, but never being specific in that kind of way, at least when it comes to prophecies. That prophecies gesture towards a future that is yet to come. Prophecies are ambiguous, ambivalent, right? And in that way, they have what to teach us now, but they're not telling us to put all your money in Bitcoin or something like that, right? That's not what Torah is doing. Torah is not Nostradamus. Torah is wisdom, not stock tips. Right? If Torah was just like something that could be satisfied, then Torah would end. Right? Torah would be over once the prophecy came true. And that's why they say, no, the prophecies are about the end of time. Right? Torah will be done when time is over. Right? So what is Torah then? Actually, Torah extends throughout all of human history. Right? Torah keeps on being true. Now you can say, fine, Torah in its discrete form. Revelation is over, but Torah continues. Okay, fine. So we have, again, this repetition of this tension. Reish Lakish is saying revelation is something that resonates, reiterates, fractures, and replicates. Whereas Rabbanan, I think maybe like the precedent for what Rashbam said above, saying this is something that's very interesting. Revelation at Sinai does not resonate. It has to be a discrete moment. It's not, I wonder if they're trying to say because you need to receive it, and thus it needs to be receivable. And it can't be receivable if it is just zooming all over the place and splitting into a zillion pieces. It's not echoing, which means why? What do you have with Revelation? Said Rabbanan? Clarity. But something clear is something discrete. Right? Something with clear beginning and a middle and an end. So it's more of a pragmatic model of revelation. And it distinguishes, in a sense, between, again, the originary moment and further divine communication of these echoes. Okay, so here we have a tussle, right, about the moment. Was the moment of revelation something that was discrete, had a clear beginning and an end? Or is revelation something that's explosive and resonant, something that begins but then doesn't end? And we see either Reish Lakish saying, like prophecy, the 7 to 70 voices, and then above we even saw Rabbi Yitzchak said, all prophecy was revealed at Sinai, meaning it was all revealed to Moses, but it's revealed to the rest of us later. So we keep on having these like mini Sinais down the road as prophets reveal themselves. Okay, so we have models, right? We have a model of, let's say the most conservative model is Rabbanan, who say that the revelation happened point X. That's revelation. No echo. That's it. Torah, revelation. Over. Done. Then let's say Rashbam's a little bit more loose and says revelation was so singular it never happened again. But he's not like defining its beginning and end. But he's saying it's something that was not repeatable. It cannot happen again. And then we have, I think Reish Lakish saying it splits into 770 and zooms out into the rest of the prophets. And then I think ultimately the most radical position of revelation is total. It is holistic, contains everything ever God will ever, would ever say to us. Which, again, on one hand, you could say that's actually identical with Rabbanan, but I want to say that another way of reading it is that it is something that keeps on unfolding as we become further aware of it. Okay, so let's look at Sfas Emes, and we'll see where, in a sense, he might actually wants us to, instead of like relitigating the event at Sinai, he wants to actually bring our attention back to Torah itself. So he says, and this is his commentary on Akiv. He says, Ha'inyan hu, dekasuv. What does it mean when it says, Im shama tishma'u? Right, we know that from, If you truly listen, right, to the words of Torah. Rashi says, Shamua b'yashan tishma b'chadash. He says, Shamoa, old. Yashan, like Kemach Yashan, old flour, right? Shamoa, you've heard what has been said. Tishma, you will hear of new statements, new Torah, new words. So Shamoa is past participle. Tishma is the future tense, right? Shamoa is what has been heard. Tishma is you will hear. We see how the grammar orients our perspective in new ways. So what you've heard and what you will hear. V'inyan hu, and the idea is, the kasuv, as it's written, kol gadol v'lo yasaf. Our verse is back. It was a great voice that did not yasaf. Lo pasak. He says, what does lo yasaf mean? It never ended. Whoa. Because even, right, we haven't seen that happen yet. Reish Lakish said there were 70. That's still a number. Rebbe Yitzchak, who I want to say is like a radical version, but still, it's a totalizing version. It did end at Sinai, but we're hearing about it later. But Sfas Emes says it was a great voice that never ended. That's not even an echo. That's the voice that never ends. The actual source voice never stopped. What breath support? Kivyachol. Ki hadivarim chayim v'kayamim. Because the words are alive and are sustained. They exist. V'akadosh baruch hu nosein haTorah tamid. God eternally gives the Torah. God is giving the Torah always. Achen, kifi kiyum haTorah v'mitzvos kein yecholim lishmoa chadashos b'chol eis. Accordingly, according to the keeping of Torah, the fulfilling of Torah, and of the mitzvahs, one is able to hear new things in every moment. Gewalt. So where does Sfas Emes relocate the site of revelation? He moves it. I mean, this is the one that really is against Rashbam. Because Rashbam is saying, moment of revelation, like being at the mountain. If you weren't there, you really missed out. Because boy, oh boy, Har Sinai Fest 800 was 1200s BCE was amazing, right? You had to have been there. If you weren't there, you couldn't even understand. For him, it's really about like, and we get it. We went into why, right? Really trying to actually like cultivate a sense of how important and unique that moment was. But the Sfas Emes pushes back and says, no, the power of Torah and the power of God is that moment, in a sense, is not unique. It's just the first in a series. It is the first of other moments of revelation you will have. Now, yes, again, we have to qualify this. You are not empowered to write a new Torah. There is one Torah. But it is being revealed to you constantly. Because the more you engage with it, the more it says to you. The more ideas it communicates to you. The more ways of relating to it communicates to you. The more ways Torah can mean reveal themselves to you. So the site of revelation moves from being a historical event at Har Sinai to being at our own little Sinai every time we crack open a Sefer, every time we go to shul, right? Every time that we learn with a friend on Zoom, whatever it is. That revelation is a reiterative event. It keeps on happening again and again and again. The Torah doesn't stop speaking. Lo yasaf, lo pasak, does not cease. It is a source I want to add, but I think I'll just give it after because I have to find it. But I'll say it outside. The Taz, the Turei Zav, one of the classical commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, right? It's not a book you go to for like spirituality, but you're wrong because the halacha is spirituality. The question is, and he's not the only one who says this, and the Sfas Emes is hinting at this point, but I want to say it explicitly. The shaila he's asking is, why is it that when we say Birkas HaTorah, when we say the blessing of the Torah, when you're called to an aliyah, why doesn't it say Baruch Atah Hashem Nasan HaTorah? Why doesn't it say blessed are you God who gave the Torah? Right? God gave the Torah at Sinai. Right? That's what Rashbam said. According to Pshat, Lo Nosaf, it never happened again. Baruch Atah Hashem Natan HaTorah. God gave the Torah. And he says, no. He says, it has to be Nosein Torah. God gives the Torah. Why? He says, Kadosh Baruch Hu Nosein Torah b'chol eis ve'eis. Because it says, I think pushing even the Sfas Emes a little bit further, he says, it's not just you learn Torah and you hear new things. God is giving the Torah constantly. in every moment. So we say when we take the Aliyah for the Torah, we're not just paying homage to a special thing that happened in the past, which we have no direct access to. We are maintaining an active, alive, dynamic connection with an active, alive, dynamic Torah. A Torah that is alive, the words that vibrate still, the words that resonate and radiate still. So that is, I would say, the other side of the equation. So just to summarize before we close. So I think what we have here are two different models based in, again, the hermeneutics, like the reading of this verse, Lo Yasaf. And I think they really both have what to tell us, and especially both in terms of understanding Shavuos and also understanding our relationship to Torah. So let's say the more conservative version of "There's a great voice that did not continue," that there's something special about singling out the specialness of that event of connection between us and God, the unique quality of what it was like at Sinai. And thus, Shavuos is about trying to reconnect us through our ritual, through our cyclical calendar to that moment. It's Zman Matan Toratenu. It's the time of the giving of the Torah, and we reconnect to this catalyzing event. So the specialness of that event is something worth treasuring and worth paying attention to. But we run the risk then of disempowering ourselves, seeing us as, while we might remember that event or recall what it was like or restage it, we're of a lower character, we're of a lower grade because we weren't really there. We see that model nowadays, especially in like Permission to Receive, the book. It says, like, it's a game of telephone and people who are closer to the source have a more accurate reception of it. And Sfas Emes wouldn't agree with that. Now, Sfas Emes is the most radical version of the other side, saying, no, what giving the Torah was a moment of it was a catalyst. It was catalyzing something. It was making a chain reaction. It wasn't a game of telephone where it gets weaker as it goes on. It gets stronger as things explode and radiate and shine for us even brighter than it ever was before. The Torah is not something that fades with time, but it's actually something that grows with time. And for that, I think what we have is a different aspect of Shavuos, namely that it's not about, on one hand, we have these beautiful rituals of like having flowers on the bima to make it look like Har Sinai, because Har Sinai was like exploding in flowers, beautiful images. So on one hand, we want to treasure the Sinai moment, but on the other hand, in the Tikkun Leil Shavuos and other ways, we show that actually our real commitment to Torah isn't just homage to a historical moment. It's a continued, committed, and enthusiastic relationship to the alive, dynamic Torah that we have received. That Torah is something that we persist in having a relationship with because Torah continues to reveal itself to us, continues to give us new ways to understand it and new ways to relate ourselves to it. So there we have, I think, it's always the case. There's no right or wrong, and I really meant it, not just in terms of like taking a side, but they both have something to teach us. To treasure the moment as something special, but also to invest ourselves in a relationship and to what other ways that we can devote ourselves to it and the ways that it shows itself to us. And considering the eternity of Torah and the eternity of God, it's a process that will never end. Baruch Hashem. Yashikoach. Thank you so much for joining. The sun has set. Everything is very faded and dark and grainy. There we go. Thank you so much for joining for the Learning Post-Shavuos class. It's always post-Shavuos. We're always after receiving the Torah, but Torah keeps on happening. So we will have our next Parsha chat Thursday evening at 7:30, looking at the Parsha of Bahaloischa, menorahs, trumpets, all kinds of cool stuff. Meat coming out of your nose. And we'll have a Kabbalah Shabbos Friday evening at 7:30, Havdalah probably around 9:50 on Saturday evening. And then keep your eyes peeled for an announcement for a new series, which I will be in the process of preparing. Please feel free to reach out via email if you have texts or people or ideas or themes that you'd be passionate about learning. And I'm excited to see what else we could do together. Also, keep your eyes peeled because soon, God willing, Mirza Shem Kanahara will be meeting again in person at Beth Lida for shul. So if you want to see other people and have a lovely, pleasant experience praying in our lovely, pleasant backyard, then you'll have opportunities in June. We'll be re-meeting again. Bli Neder. I'll keep you posted on that. So thanks so much for joining. Have a great night.
Like, good night. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Josh.